We are in the midst of a deadly pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has killed over 890,000 people and affected every facet of daily existence. These do appear to be unprecedented times, for no other virus of recent memory has afflicted humanity to the degree in which the coronavirus has. And yet, this isn't the first time that mankind has been ravaged by widespread illness. For instance, in 1918, there was the Spanish flu, which took the lives of 20 to 50 million people. And in the mid-19th century, the third cholera pandemic had a death toll of 1 million. The subject of this video, though, is an ancient pandemic, the so-called Justinianic Plague. The Justinianic Plague is the popular name for a pandemic of bubonic plague, which afflicted the late Roman or Byzantine Empire in the 6th century CE. The pandemic reappeared in waves in different regions over the next 200 years, finally reaching its culmination in the 8th century. Due to the fact that there have been multiple pandemics of bubonic plague in history, scholars sometimes refer to the Justinianic Plague as the quote-unquote first plague pandemic so as to distinguish it from the quote-unquote second plague pandemic of the 14th century and the quote-unquote third plague pandemic of the 19th century. Now, I should mention that the reason why it's called the Justinianic Plague is that the first outbreak occurred during the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I. Yersinia pestis, the bacteria which causes plague, originated in Central Asia during the Neolithic era. Scientific evidence suggests that it then reached the Great Lakes region of Africa via overland and sea trade routes. The maligned black rat was the primary vector of the disease, meaning that it carried the oriental rat flea, which acted as a host to the bacteria, which in turn infected humans. However, some scholars now contend that humans, who can also carry lice and fleas, may have been secondary vectors and thus assisted in the spread of plague by transmitting it to each other directly. In 541 CE, Procopius of Caesarea, the principal Byzantine historian of the 6th century, identified the beginning of the Justinianic Plague in Pelusium on the Nile River's northern and eastern shores. The disease followed the established trade routes of the Byzantine Empire, and thus spread from Ethiopia to Egypt and then throughout the Mediterranean region and the Levant. However, it failed to make substantial inroads into both northern Europe and the Mediterranean countryside. In 542, it reached the affluent Byzantine capital Constantinople. The disease was brought to the city by infected rats and fleas inhabiting grain ships arriving from Egypt. Stored in capacious warehouses, grain provided a perfect breeding ground for the fleas and rats, which were crucial to the transmission of plague. William Rosen in Justinian's Flea contends that while rats are known to eat just about anything, grain is their most preferred meal. Rosen further notes that these pesky little rodents usually do not travel more than 200 meters from their birthplaces over the course of their lifetimes. However, once aboard the grain boats and carts, the rats were carried throughout the Mediterranean world. Warfare and international trade facilitated the spread of the disease throughout the Byzantine Empire. Justinian spent much of the early years of his reign subjugating a variety of notable enemies. He battled the Ostrogoths for control of the Italian peninsula, fought with the bellicose Vandals and Berbers in order to conquer North Africa, and repelled the incessant incursions of the Franks, Slavs, Avars, and other barbarian peoples. Historians have concluded that soldiers and the supply trains which supported their military endeavors acted as the means of transmission for the rats and fleas carrying the plague. By 542 CE, Justinian had reconquered much of the territory of the once unified Roman Empire, but, as Wendy Orient points out, the peace, prosperity, and commerce that this reconquest brought about also provided conditions conducive to a plague outbreak. By the mid-6th century, Constantinople blossomed into the Byzantine Empire's center of commercial trade. The capital's location along the Black and Aegean Seas placed it at the perfect crossroads for trade routes from Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, and thus this made it incredibly susceptible to falling victim to a pandemic. For, where trade and commerce went, so went rats, fleas, and the plague. In History of the Wars, Procopius describes the devastation and chaos wrought by the plague in explicit detail. Quote, "Now the disease in Byzantium ran a course of 4 months, and its greatest virulence lasted about 3. And at first, the deaths were a little more than the normal. Then the mortality rose still higher, and afterwards the tale of dead reached 5,000 each day, and again it even came to 10,000 and still more than that. Now in the beginning each man attended to the burial of the dead of his own house, and these they threw even into the tombs of others, either escaping detection or using violence. But afterwards confusion and disorder everywhere became complete. For slaves remained destitute of masters, and men who in former times were very prosperous were deprived of the service of their domestics, who were either sick or dead, and many houses became completely destitute of human inhabitants. For this reason it came about that some of the notable men of the city, because of the universal destitution, remained unburied for many days." End quote. Procopius notes that those who contracted the plague endured a hard fever accompanied by bubonic swelling below the abdomen, within the armpits, beside the ears, and at different points on the thighs. Victims often suffered from delusions and nightmares, while some even lapsed into comas. Many died immediately after the onset of symptoms, but others were tormented for days before their death. Those who were ill and sought treatment were required to either attain the services of medical practitioners or utilize homemade remedies. Most medical personnel of this period consisted of trained physicians. The education received by medical students was based in the teachings of the Greek physician Galen, who was influenced in his understanding of disease by the theory of humorism. In On the Nature of Man, the classical Greek physician Hippocrates describes this theory as follows. Quote, "The human body contains blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These are the things that make up its constitution and cause its pains and health. Health is primarily that state in which these constituent substances are in the correct proportion to each other, both in strength and quantity, and are well mixed. Pain occurs when one of the substances presents either a deficiency or an excess, or is separated in the body and not mixed with others." End quote. In essence, the imbalance of humors, or what was called dyscrasia, was perceived to be the direct cause of all diseases. Health was associated with a balance of humors, or eucrasia. We now know that humorism is not backed by any legitimate science, and it is essentially a form of pseudoscience. However, the treatments which physicians offered to those affected by the Justinianic Plague were nonetheless grounded in this peculiar theory, and therefore tended to be rather ineffective and sometimes incredibly detrimental to one's health. Bloodletting, one of the most extreme of such treatments, intended to expel a surfeit of a particular humor by quite literally draining one's blood. As you can imagine, this loss of blood often led to the patient's death. Those who lacked access to a physician usually turned to home remedies. William Rosen identifies various approaches people took towards treating the plague, including cold water baths, powders blessed by saints, magic amulets and rings, and various drugs, especially alkaloids. If these approaches to treatment failed, as they usually did, people turned to hospitals or found themselves subject to quarantining. Those who did survive were credited, according to Rosen, with, quote, "good fortune, strong underlying health, and an uncompromised immune system." End quote. The Justinianic Plague resulted in the political decline of the Byzantine Empire. It especially weakened the empire's ability to maintain its borders. As the disease decimated the Mediterranean's urban population, the Byzantine military shrunk and grew incredibly weak, and this emboldened many of the empire's most inveterate enemies. In 568, the Lombards invaded northern Italy, defeated the small Byzantine garrison there, and established the Kingdom of the Lombards. In North Africa and the Middle East, the empire was unable to repel the repeated encroachments of Arab tribes. And within the heart of the empire, Constantinople was subjected to the depredations of the Goths. The plague caused the Mediterranean's urban population to decline, and this ruined the Byzantine Empire's administrative and economic structures. Trade throughout the Mediterranean grew stagnant, and the agricultural sector was devastated. Less people meant fewer farmers who produced less grain, and this state of affairs caused prices to soar and tax revenues to decline. The near collapse of the economic system did not dissuade Justinian from demanding the same level of taxes from his ravaged population, though. In his secret history, Procopius records the economic devastation of the Byzantine countryside and reports on the merciless taxation endured by the freeholders. Quote, "When pestilence swept through the whole known world, and notably the Roman Empire, wiping out most of the farming community and of necessity, leaving a trail of desolation in its wake, Justinian showed no mercy towards the ruined freeholders. Even then, he did not refrain from demanding the annual tax, not only the amount at which he assessed each individual, but also the amount for which his deceased neighbors were liable." End quote. By the pandemic's culmination, 20 to 40% of the inhabitants of Constantinople had perished. Throughout the rest of the Byzantine Empire, nearly 25% of the population died, with estimates ranging from 25 to 50 million people in total. While a 6th century plague might appear to be an esoteric subject, it actually has great relevance to our modern world, which is continually threatened by emerging diseases. We must always be aware of our susceptibility to these public health crises, if we are to be adequately prepared for them when they inevitably come. Let the Justinianic Plague and the other pandemics of history serve as a cautionary tale, reminding us that we are not immune to such catastrophes. Do not be blinded by the notion that humanity rules nature, for natural disasters and pandemics show that nature instead rules us.